Welcome into the Backroads Bill podcast. I'm Ben, and normally our podcast is mostly centered around Northern Ontario, or at least it has some sort of connections. But today we are going to be focusing more in Bill and I's backyard to talk about North Bay and a little bit more specifically the North Bay waterways and some of the really cool history. So we brought on City Councillor Chris Mayne, who took off his political cap and to put on his canoeing hat, an outdoors hat. Some of you who know Chris, of course, might be familiar with the fact that he is part of the board for the Friends of the Vase portage, which is a portage here in North Bay that Chris and his team have revitalized and really made accessible again for the public. It's a really beautiful scene. We've got a couple of amazing photos that Chris supplied. He has a whole PowerPoint presentation on all of his different adventures, but he supplied us with some amazing photos. So if you're watching the video version of this podcast on the North Bay Echo YouTube channel, then you'll be able to see some of those things in there. Really cool, really neat conversation with Chris. I saw a side of him that I didn't know existed, and maybe a lot of people who only see him as a city councillor don't realize that he has. So either way, really amazing conversation with him, and we're going to get to all of that. But before we do, I just want to ask for you, the listener, to interact with our content a little bit. Give us a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the show on whatever platform you listen on. Go to our social media, which is North Bay Echo, and subscribe there on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok. It allows us to continue to grow not just this show, but the network as a whole, and also to attract our amazing sponsors, including today's lead sponsor, Source for Sports.
Sports aren't just what we do, they're who we are. Source for Sports North Bay is your advocate, your local support system, and your biggest fan. 1321 Fisher Street has grown from a place where knowledgeable experts can help you find exactly the gear you need, to the hotbed of team uniforms, apparel and fanwear, to a community stronghold for all the things that truly matter to you and your family's sports journey. We love helping you find your first pair of skates, as much as we relish supporting local leagues, teams, and athletes. Wherever your sports journey takes you, make sure you visit Source for Sports North Bay at 1321 Fisher Street so we can help you along your way.
Well, back in, I think it was November or December, we had today's guest on Echo Essentials. We are pleased to have Chris Mayne in. During that time, you came in as a city councillor. You came in talking about, Castle Arms, Castle Home. But at the end of that, you were talking about your canoe stories and trips. And so we wanted to get you onto the podcast. I said I'd reach out. We got you in. Welcome on to the Backroads Bill podcast, Chris Mayne.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. No, I said at the time what I really want to do is sit down with Bill and do a podcast on canoeing. Forget all the politics stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yes, we're not going to talk.
We're
We're going to talk about the politics of canoeing, I suppose, if there are politics involved in that in our pastime. But Chris is synonymous. His name is synonymous with the Vase portage. Friends of the Vase portages, I should say, and even going back further, Chris, I remember as a member, Restore the Link, and we're going to talk a bit about that. And we're also going to transition into some of the favorite canoe trips because Chris and I know Ben, for instance, and I know you were in the canoe in the North Bay Mattawa canoe race, and that was on the podcast as well. An earlier
I did
podcast,
very good.
You did indeed.
Yep.
I take 4 days to do that trip. Okay.
Well, to be fair, we got it at Trout Lake.
Yeah.
And then
when people
Michaela capsized us.
When people do it between 6 and 8 hours, it's just when I always think about it, it blows my mind. But North Bay is a mecca when you think about the jumping off points in all 4 cardinal directions, where you can go north to the Demogamy Wilderness, south to Algonquin Park, 2 world-class canoe areas, and of course west to Killarney and other places, and east the Mattawa, Ottawa rivers. But Chris, welcome, and let's just start again. I mean, we're old or not old, but going back to the early days of the Restore the Link and eventually the whole aspect of how important, because I think I'd like you to start off by talking about how important historically, before the railway, the Vase portages are.
So the Vase portages have always been here, and pre-European contact, it was a developed trade route for Anishinaabeg and Nipissing First Nations. They would travel from Lake Nipissing down the French, visit families and groups on Georgian Bay, Lake Huron. In the other direction, they would trade and deal with the Algonquin. So the trade route has always been there. And when William Logan came through in 1845, on his maps, he even noted that at the junction of Cooper's Lake and the North Vase, he recorded not Nipissing First Nation, but that there were natives actually living shoreline. And, what an interesting place to be as people travel back and forth between the areas. You're right there, seeing them, talking with them, dealing with them as they go through. And Darren Renaud, in his research, recorded that at the mouth of Vase and also at the mouth of Calendar Bay were well-established family settlements or villages, before the Europeans even came in. So wonderful history of the canoe route. And then as the Europeans arrived, initially by Brulé at the behest of Champlain, and then Champlain himself, and then developing into the fur trade route, it became one of the most famous portages of the Trans-Canada Canoe Route, Lachine, to the Northwest Territories in Canada.
It is one of the most historic and important portages, and I've written about this many, many times. Back in the day of the early North Bay Board of Trade, then North Bay Chamber of Commerce, we'll say circa Murray Leatherdale's time, the significance of the portage came late. Then let's fast forward into the 1980s, when I know we got the extension of the Mattawa River as a Canadian Heritage River. That was one of the projects. But then the whole aspect of restoring the link was the first kind of phase of where we are today.
Well, I'm going to back up to circa 1964. I've got a picture of Murray Leatherdale, Hartley Trussler, Dick Taffel. I think Rudy Warren was another one. But they were actually dedicating the Ministry of Tourism sign that's still beside Vase Portages right now on the highway. So 1964, Murray Leatherdale and some others had been involved in a bit of a Friends of Champlain Society. They got the MTO to recognize Vase. They put up the sign. What I love to tell Dick, and I hope he's listening to this podcast, of those 5 people in the picture, Dick is the only one who's still here. But, as a young lawyer coming to North Bay, that was one of the first things he was involved with, was getting the sign up. So everyone's, I think Eric Morris and even Roy Summers were involved with it around the edges at that time as well. So everyone's always known about it, but there have been issues with private property along the route. So you could kind of stagger through the bush and try and, bushwhack your way through, but it wasn't as publicly accessible as it could have been, I guess. So I'll credit Paul Chivers. I think Paul was just driving it to do a nugget story in the day about 1997-ish, give or take. And he noticed the house that had been built on the patented lands that basically were the trailhead on the Trout Lake side. He noticed the house was for sale. So Paul got together, yourself, Gord Miller, a group of friends, and formed the group Restore the Link, raised some money, and with provincial support, bought the house. The house was demolished. The property was donated to the North Bay Mattawa Conservation Authority, but that was the first time that the Trout Lake trailhead was back in public ownership and available in, I think it was almost 115 years since the property was first patented. So that was a huge start to reopening the access to Vase portages.
Yeah, it was. And of course, we'll talk a little bit, I think, now, Chris, about where we're at with the Friends of the Vase portages, because that work by community members has been going on now for quite some time. And again, in my mind, I always think, this is it's a difficult thing because of the patented land, but it's still there, and it's still that connectivity over the height of land between 2 different drainage systems, and I think sometimes people forget about how important those Vase portages are.
Yep. So on the canoe route, the Vase portages, one of the first portages from Perron's Pond into Cooper's Lake. If you go to the bathroom on one side, it drains into the French River and the Great Lakes. If you go to the bathroom on the other side, it goes into Trout Lake and down the Ottawa River. So this was the height of land between Lachine, Montreal, and Sault Ste. Marie. The voyageurs would paddle up the Ottawa River, cross Vase, and when they reached here, it was the height of land. They would celebrate. So they would dig into their cargo, crack open one of the cases of fermented wine or brandy, and celebrate reaching the height of land. So in some of the older maps, circa 1880, 1870, it was recorded as Shkuta Wabe Saigon, and pardon my Ojibwe, but that's as close as I get, which translates into Firewater Lake, because when they got here, they would celebrate reaching the height of land. Today, for anyone who drives at Highway 17 when you go by it, it's simply called Brandy Lake, and that's where the name comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Bill. What was the question?
Yeah. So we're just fast forward to where we're at today as far as projects for the organization and anything that might be looking forward to the future.
Sure. So what I was going to do is actually rewind back to Restore the Link. So, congratulations to the group for buying the property, donating it to Conservation Authority. So now the trailhead is in public ownership. And I remember talking to Susan Christensen, Conservation Authority, a few years after that. Okay, so boy, that's great that the portages are opening and people can use them again. And no, they can't really, because you've got two other property owners along the route, and there are issues around that. So 2006, what actually came before council, a construction company along Vase portages was requesting rezoning by the city to change it from rural to rural extractive. They wanted to expand the mining quarries, the gravel quarries. And for anyone who's been through Birches Road and see what happens after you blast and crush the rock for 20 years, it's down to the water level. The rock cuts, the trees, they just disappear. So that was 2006. City of North Bay was proposing rezoning. A group, that's when Friends of Vase formed. Really, Paul Chivers was a big part of that. It's time to advocate for the protection of Vase and push back on the applications to increase industry and construction activity in the area. So that's what Friends of Vase started to do. Firstly, by advocating with North Bay City Council 2006. That same year, 2006, organized a canoe day. And as it got closer, one of the property owners said, well, you're not coming across my property because if you break a leg or break your neck, someone's going to sue for $1 million. Don't even think about coming across my property. I'm going to have the police ready. Okay. So we called it Sucking Swamp. We did a big half-an-hour portage around the historical Vase portages just so we could at least get to the rest of the route and get people through. So that first summer, 2006, we created our own Sucking Swamp portage. And I think that was there for a year or two. Because Vase had received some provincial media, there were canoeing groups coming in from Ottawa and Toronto that wanted to do it. And we actually took them through Sucking Swamp, and they enjoyed being waist deep in the mud so much. Like the camera crews would come in with the microphone booths. It was a lot of fun. It was actually a shame when we got back to the historical route, which is the Dryland Trail again. But we started discussions with the property owner. We understood you have concerns with liability, but this is one of the most historical canoe routes in Canada. We'd love to reopen it. And Roy Summers, a lot of people would remember. Roy Summers was a wonderful resource as a Friends of Vase member. We started to go through the Public Lands Act, and there it is, rite of passage. So right in the Public Lands Act is a section where a portage exists, a property owner may not obstruct the canoer from traveling themselves or their contents across the route. Okay, well, perfect. Ministry of Natural Resources, all we need you to do is enforce your own legislation. And it took a while to get anyone to speak to it publicly, but it was David Ramsey at the time says, well, on an interview with CBC Sudbury, well, of course we'll support that. Government always enforces the law. Perfect, great. Let's get going tomorrow. But there were still issues. So eventually, what came out of that is Ministry of Natural Resources. Some people may remember Randy Morrison. He was one of the regional managers. And although it's in legislation, it had never been challenged through the courts. There were no precedents. There was one on the Credit River near Toronto where a dam was built, and the local canoe group said, well, you have to build some kind of a portage around the dam because you're blocking our access to the river now. And the courts found that because there was no historical portage, they couldn't claim right of passage. Interesting. So here's the legislation. You can read it line by line. Ministry of Natural Resources says they're going to enforce the law, but they didn't want to go to court to establish the precedent in law. At the time, it might have cost $30,000 or $40,000 to do that. They reasonably didn't want to do that. So tell you what, is there some way we can meet with the property owner and come to an amicable agreement to achieve that easement or rite of passage, whatever it's going to be? So Randy and Morrison really was in the middle of that between Friends of La Vase and the property owner. After a couple of years, the agreement that was reached was a small piece of Brandy Lake was sawed off, given to the property owner because his property was adjacent to the Conservation Authority property. Tell you what, we'll give you this piece of property beside your house, and in exchange, we received the southwest corner of the swamp, which was the historic route. So once that was done, the historical route was back in public ownership. It's never perfect. There's still some issues downstream, but it's working. So we aren't having the private property issues that we had before. So it's 2024. For the last 16, 17 years, free access to La Vase has been there. And so starting 2006, Friends of La Vase Portages organized a canoe day, 15, 20 people, and this will be the 20th year we've actually had that canoe day. Every year, maybe one exception during COVID, we've had groups of people from 10 or 12 to 40 have gone through, and the goal is just to show people, here's where the route is, it's well maintained, it's brushed. A couple of things I love about the route, and excuse me just one moment. There are locations along the route, and Cliff Mulder, I think you know as well, as another advocate for Friends of La Vase and a big canoe history advocate. There are a couple of locations along the route where you can see what look like tire tracks in the middle of the bush. And, there were some car routes out there, but there are other places where it wasn't a car route. But if you have 4 men on either side of a 16 or 24-foot canoe going back and forth on this trail for about 80 years, what's left in the ground now are the parallel depressions that look like car tracks, but it's actually the historical canoe route. So it's wonderful to see those remnants still there. My even more favorite part to point out to people whenever we can is at the trailheads specifically, hawthorn trees. So hawthorn trees aren't native to this area. They're very recognizable. They have a little berry on them late summer, early fall, a lot like a cranberry, but it's a tree, and they have 2-inch thorns. So, if you bump into one of these, you realize it pretty quickly. But the hawthorn trees were never native to this area. When the voyageurs traveled, they put some hawthorn berries into their pemmican, same way as we do with granola bars these days. And wherever they went to relieve themselves in the woods, typically at the trailheads because you don't really see them mid-root at all. The seeds from the hawthorn berries were never digested completely, and so that's what sprouted up all these hawthorn trees all over the place.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. And Ben, we call them, excuse me, poop trees because they are indicators. And I've written about this, and on many historic portages, you will see these hawthorn trees. We'll call it the third or the most western. The top end of the portage, the Cape Paceway crosses, and it's the end of the driving range off Lakeshore Drive for some sort of spatial reference on the podcast. There's a line of hawthorn trees all along the bank. And you can also see that one spot where they would have been putting the canoes in if they were going west or taking out going east. So there is a lot of, and we could talk about the raising of the water at a couple places where they dammed up the water to help the canoes go through. There's all kinds of, we'll call it soft archaeological evidence as opposed to the digs that occurred on the island with Dr. Pat Julig and others in the past. And so when I think about it, again, the Lavads Portages is probably one of the most significant things we have in North Bay that really you can trace back.
Agreed. And just to mention it, for anyone who does the French River at Recollet Falls, just past Highway 63, right in the middle of the portage is a huge 20-foot wide and tall hawthorn tree. We were portaging that once, and I got all excited about it. I was trying to explain it to some people who just were coming down to take pictures. They thought it was crazy. I'd never called it a poop tree before, but I will in the future.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, that's sort of how and I think I have a fond remembrance with the late Roy Summers standing. I have a picture of him at the Cape Pace bridge there by Riverbend Road, and he's there, and of course you can see the sweeping nature of the curve. And of course you've mentioned one of the watercolors back in by Wolford,
yep.
and that's at the North Bay Museum as well on display. But that's georeferencing a painting.
Yeah, so if it's still on display at the North Bay Museum, wonderful to hear. The original is in the Toronto Public Library. So what it is, it's a copy of the oldest image of North Bay. John Elliott Wolford was a military officer and an artist. In the summer of 1819, he traveled with the Governor General of Upper Canada.
Devonshire.
Was it Devonshire?
I think so.
Okay.
One of them, early ones.
Yep, I'm just trying to... Anyway, traveled the Governor General of Upper Canada. This is about 10 years ahead of the invention of photography. So if you're traveling with the Governor General of Upper Canada, he's telling you to paint the waterfalls, paint the tents on the shoreline. So coming from west to east across Lake Nipissing, the first place they landed was, of course, the first portage on Vase Portages, which is right at the bend of the road. If you're standing on the Cape Pace Bridge looking towards Pinewood Park, where the nets are for the driving range, right there was the location of the first portage. So in this watercolor by John Elliott Wolford, you can see the bend in the river that's still very visible today. So ahead of photography, 1819, this is the oldest image of North Bay, and it's Vase Portages.
Well, we're going to take a quick break from Chris and all of this amazing history that, to be honest, as we were prepping for this, the conversation took a completely different turn in a good way. I've learned so much from Chris so far, but we are going to take what one might call a quick coffee break. And what better place to visit after a relaxing day on the lake than by visiting our sponsor, Twigs Coffee Roasters. Of course, Twigs over 5 locations that will serve you across North Bay, Sturgeon Falls, and Sudbury. So no matter where you are in this kind of general area, there is a Twigs that you can visit. They have some absolutely fantastic selections, whether it's their amazing drink options with both cold and hot drinks. They have some great coffee there, great different blends. If you're a dark roast person, absolutely fantastic. When I did 52 coffees and the different meetings and stuff, 99% of the time it was at Twigs. And I got used to their coffee quite quickly, and honestly, it's fantastic. They've got great service, and it's cool because it doesn't matter if you're there for breakfast or for lunch. If you want something light, you can get maybe a croissant, or you can get a bagel, or one of their muffins or scones, or you can choose one of their amazing sandwiches. So lots of stuff that you can go. So the next time that you need a coffee break or you need to go in and get something, consider visiting the closest Twigs to you. And thank you, Twigs Coffee Roasters, for continuing to support not just the Echo Network, but the Backroads Bill podcast. It's time to Toyota at North Bay Toyota. Attention truck lovers. Have you been Tundra struck? The powerful and dependable Toyota Tundra is the new definition of grit. Ask us about amazing lease deals on a 2025 Tundra Double Cab SR 4-wheel drive and experience ingenious levels of capability, technology, and refinement. Or maybe you're an SUV lover? Take advantage of a limited shipment of 2025 RAV4s and discover the perfect blend of style, comfort, and efficiency in a compact SUV that ignites your desire to explore. Right now, get excellent lease deals on the Toyota RAV4 LE all-wheel drive and more. It's time to Toyota at North Bay Toyota, 640 McEwen, or online at northbaytoyota.com for details.
Hey, I'm on the legacy committee, and actually I'm going to a meeting right after there. Maybe we should have a plaque. When you think about it, I really like the analogy of the first.
It is, yeah.
It is the first representation, visual image of early North Bay. Ben, you've been patient here.
Well, I was just going to say it's neat, like having grown up here my whole life. There's so much you don't know, especially like even the portage itself and the connections between all these big and different lakes. Like when we did the canoe. Race, right? Like even being able to go from Trout Lake to the end of the end of Mattawa, right? Just being able to do that is pretty crazy. I wanted to take a little bit step away from the Lavaz a little bit, just because obviously you're known as a political guy, but where did the inspiration for the outdoors come from for you? Because people know you from as city councillor or all these other things you've done in the public. I didn't pin you originally for an outdoors guy, but you have this love of this history and outdoors.
In this shirt.
I was just going to say, he's got a plaid shirt on.
To be fair,
today not be an outdoorsy guy.
Well, today you did, but No,
so we grew. High school years, we grew up in Trout Lake. So Trout Lake, in your youth, if you're out in a canoe all day, literally all day long, paddling up and down Trout Lake, you start to go down the Mattawa River, which is a beautiful canoe route by itself. Yes, that's where the interest came. And then at some point, okay, well, where else can I go? So you start to go through Temagami, then you start to go on the French River, then you start to go into Algonquin. I'm fortunate I've canoed the Nahanni River, which to me is one of the most impressive canoe routes in Canada. Virginia Falls, which is the centerpiece, is twice the height of Niagara Falls. And for 2 weeks, you're literally canoeing through canyons, whitewater. It's just an amazing trip. The Bowron Lake Circuit near Quesnel in the middle of British Columbia. Did that with my kids a few years ago. Jasper Park, Maligne Lake. Anyone who goes to Jasper and enjoys canoeing, Maligne Lake is about 45 minutes south of Jasper, and it's one of these turquoise lakes surrounded by mountains with glaciers and no portaging. You can camp up to 5 nights on the lake, but just another beautiful place to go canoeing. So, yeah, it's just something I kind of developed an interest in high school years, and just it's expanded over the years. And very fortunate to have been able to have done as much as I've done. Look forward to still doing more. And Friends of Lavaz has been a great group of friends to advocate for Lavaz, but everyone who's there is also keen. An avid canoeist.
Absolutely. And again, I know I was 16 when I went down the Mattawa River in high school for the first time, didn't know anything. When people asked me when it started, that was it. It was it for me. And then similar, you start to explore. So that's a nice transition, Chris, to...
hold it. I'm going to back up. I'm going to do a completely different... I'm going to title this the Darren Renaud Sidebar. Do you remember Darren?
No.
Wonderful young man. unfortunately passed away about 2 years ago in a car accident, which was very unfortunate. But he was Algonquin First Nation. He enjoyed researching the history of the area. So I'm going to share the story as much as it ties into Le Vase. So 1680, plus or minus, Murray Leatherdale in his book, Booth de Boulay, referred to it as the Flight of the Nipissing. Mm-hmm. So 1680, the Iroquois were coming up the Ottawa Valley, scorched earth, killing, burning everyone in their path. They were sponsored by, I believe, the Dutch. They were trying to take over the fur trade industry, and to do that, they were basically killing everyone all along the way. So locally, the First Nation families at the mouth of Le Vase was one. The mouth of, or Long Green Point on Calendar Bay was the other group of families. They were where the Iroquois were coming. One early spring evening, someone noticed the Iroquois were now camped on what's Elks Beach near Brandy Lake. Okay, and they would likely be attacking the villages in the morning. This person was able to get through. The families living at the mouth of Le Vase. Picture end of April when there's about a 50, 60-foot margin between the ice and the shoreline. He was able to give them the warning. They got in their canoes and they left. And they went to Sturgeon Falls, eventually Moosonee, Lake Nipigon, but they got away safely. The families who were at Green Point on Calendar Bay was blocked by the ice, unfortunately. So it was 2 or 3 days before they could try and escape. When they went by the mouth of Le Vase portages, now the Iroquois warriors were there, and there was a battle between the two of them, significant loss of lives at Le Vase portages. So it's interesting, tragic history that not everybody knows about, but it's interesting to have a better sense of what happens in the area. Unfortunately, Darren passed away. His wife, Nikki Poulin, still has all the research that he did on that, and I'm not sure that she's as comfortable bringing the story forward as Darren was. But anyway, wonderful history involving Le Vase as well.
When I tell that part of the story, I always refer to there's a plaque up at Nipigon because the Bising or Nipissings were at the time was called the Indian Wars because the Dutch and the English aligned with the Iroquois, and of course the French aligned with the Algonquin and Ojibwe speakers, and they were driven for a period of time out of this area and had to relocate near Nipigon, and then eventually came back to their homeland, so to speak. And so there's so much to know, Ben, as you just said.
Yeah, you agree. They overwintered in Nipigon for a year or two. Eventually, with the Huron, they pushed the Iroquois back to, I think the final battle was in Peterborough area, where the Algonquin were almost completely annihilated. And, the story I've heard is that they left one young male, one young female child because the Huron didn't want to be accused of genocide or whatever the term was. But you're right, interesting here, history.
And it's always fun or interesting to listen to the history, because there's obviously so much ties to the Indigenous people and to any sort of outdoor stuff at all, especially when you hear of the portages or anything like that.
Well, here we go, another sidebar.
Here we go, yeah.
So, Bill, you mentioned it, the fort at the mouth of the Vase portages. Would have been a trading post, selling flowers, selling guns, selling buckshot, whatever they sold in the day. Toussaint and Eustache Laurent were the co-owners of the business. So sometimes people ask me or ask us as friends of the Vase, so gee, where did everybody go? Where did all the people who were the villages at the mouth of Le Vase, and where did they all go? So Gerald Laurent, professor at Nipissing University, his son Andrew, is a fifth-generation descendant, I believe, from 50-50. It's either Eustache or Toussaint. But Gerald is a fifth-generation descendant of, let's say, Toussaint Laurent. So everyone is still here. And, the families, Garden Village, Nipissing First Nation, the McLeods, they all are descendants from those original Nipissing First Nation Nipissarians. The history, it's living history.
Yeah, and the clans lived all along the lakeshore, as you've pointed out. And again, the lavage was one of the ways to cross that height of land. And again, with the impact of the colonialists, well, it became even more important. And I don't want to say the rest is history, but you have something more to say.
Roy Summers, sidebar.
Yeah.
Okay, separate discussion. And I know you've voiced a different opinion on this, but 1870-ish, Alexander Nivens came out with a map, the first survey of all the concession lots through North Bay. He did that survey. We still use him in the city of North Bay now. He recorded the portage from Armstrong Beach along the base of Ski Club Hill through North Bay, reaching Nipissing, almost where Marina Point is now.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it was and it's actually recorded on the survey maps as a dry land trail.
Alexander Nivens, I've written him about. He was an all-star surveyor, and he was so accurate. Not only did he put that portage, but the early survey maps have the lavage portages in their entirety, so to speak. Before, if I go through, and I have been, or I just go to the Cape Pace Bridge or something, I think, oh, it's too bad there's been all those changes or modifications based on human impact, because if you could ever restore it in its entirety, it is kind of a really neat route, so to speak. Just historically, because you're walking in the footsteps of all kinds of legends.
Oh, agreed.
Whether,
yes.
Mackenzie, all the explorers, they had to go that way, and that's the way they were. They were mostly guided by First Nations people that lived along the shoreline.
Oh, agreed. There were existing trails.
Yeah.
But the discussion was, here's a dry land trail.
Yeah.
How often did they use that rather than lavage?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was actually one of three routes through the city.
Absolutely.
There was the dry land route, Ojibwe-Sipi, which goes from the Cove on Trout Lake to Camelot Lake to McLean Lake to Passmore to Twin Lakes, eventually picks up Parks Creek and comes into Lake Nipissing again. It's actually, about an hour-ish shorter than lavage. I've done it.
Yep.
But in the large 24-foot canoes with all the freight, they didn't want to do the 5 or 6 portages, and it's a very shallow little creek. But if you had a small personal canoe, 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, that's the route you likely would have taken. So, anyway.
There were all these routes through the North Bay area. Ben, did you have another question about this?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes left, so I just wanted to get this. So we've been talking about a lot of different routes and lakes in North Bay. And what I wanted to know from both of you, because you can both, I feel like I'm sitting with two Bills right now, just with the amount of knowledge and stuff. What I want to know,
I thought you were sitting with two Chris's.
Or two Chris's, there you go. What I want to know is, if somebody came to North Bay, they've got a canoe, and they go, what is your definitive route to kind of see the best portages or lakes or areas in North Bay? What's the route that you would suggest they take?
Okay, Ben, we know this is really you, okay?
Well, I can't even get out of Trout Lake, so we'll see.
Okay, so I'll go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so if you came to me and said, I'm here, I got my canoe, I got some gear, how long are you going to go for?
Whatever I guess whatever an average person would go for.
Well, Paul Chivers goes for 3 weeks.
Okay, well, let's say a day, let's say you're doing a day trip.
A day trip?
Okay, I don't know.
A day trip would be Pimsey Bay to Champlain Park, because that's probably the prettiest section of the Mattawa River. You go through the canyons, there's some nice paddleable rapids. But then I would say, Ben, a day trip, really? Come on, you're in the middle of two amazing world-class canoe parks. Where are you going to go? For most people, as long as you don't mind doing some portaging, as you get older, you kind of start to dodge the portages more.
Yeah.
The last few years, I've gone to Philip Edward Island, Killarney Park. Amazing place. But if you're coming here and you want to do a nice little bit of a circuit, and I fault Kevin Callan for this and his book Lost Canoe Routes. The little circuit from Matagamacy, Chiniguchi, over to Laura Lake, and back down through Matagamacy is a beautiful little canoe route. They're called the Windex Lakes by some people.
Yep, we've talked about that on this podcast.
Yeah, so that they're downwind from the Sudbury smelter. Unfortunately, the lakes have acidified. They are slowly coming back, but in the meantime, they're dead lakes. No frogs, no fish, no bacteria. You can drop a quarter and 30 feet of water and see it on the bottom. It's absolutely a beautiful place to travel to. As well, if you picture Temagami or Killarney, the white stone that everyone likes to take pictures of and talk about are the remnants of the La Cloche mountain range. So La Cloche up in Temagami, south end down at Killarney. In the middle is this section, Chiniguchi, Wolf Lake, in that area. So it's beautiful stone mountains, spectacular lookouts, beautiful index lakes to paddle through. Kevin Callan put that route in his book, Lost Canoe Routes, and all of a sudden it went from nobody going through. And actually, I'm going to give Bill a hard time.
Yeah, no, I've done that. That's true.
Person, you've done that. You told people, oh, and by the way, you can drive in there now.
You can drive into the Blue Lagoon. And of course, the Blue Lagoon, Ben, is something, it's an anomaly. And I will take the blame for that. And often I think with some thought that, you know, sometimes when you do this is what will happen. And the Blue Lagoon is a spectacular, and if you don't know it exists, you could walk right by it. I've said this to people, but
I think we've talked about it.
Well, we probably have mentioned it, but then you have this canoe route that Chris has explained. You have the pictographs at McCarthy Bay. You have the old log chutes. There's a long beach in one of the lakes on
McConnell Bay.
Yeah, and so it's one of those ones that in close proximity. The question was, you know, a day or 2 or 3 days. That would be. I concur.
Or a month at this point.
Well, I concur with both, and yes, we can fault people that do that. For me, it would be the North and South Lady Evelyn River in the Temagami Wilderness. That would be. But again, it's the matter of going beyond a day, 2 or 3 days, or let's say a short week or a long week or something like that.
But Florence Lake is beautiful too.
Yeah. Well, that is the center of the all the parks that are joined together by legislation, so to speak, in the Temagami Wilderness. Florence Lake is a true roadless area, Ben, that we have. The other areas are not roadless, but we could talk about this further, and I think this is a good segue because this is coming out next week, and we'll have Chris back at another time soon to talk about these other canoe routes because we need to do justice with them because there are things we need to talk about, I think, in each of those canoe routes.
Well, and if I can share some images at some point, a number of years ago, it was the holiday weekend in February. And, Saturday morning, beautiful Sunday morning, my wife was saying, let's go snowshoeing. And I said, I'm going to go canoeing. And she gave me that look she normally does. But Pimisi Bay, the rapids from Pimisi Bay down to Parazoo Falls, actually had been snowshoeing it the week prior. And as you snowshoe along the water course, the water's open.
Absolutely.
So the weekend later, I brought the canoe, paddled down to Parazoo Falls. The goal was to see Parazoo Falls in winter, all caked up with ice and snow, and it was beautiful, just beautiful.
Yeah, and I've done that, not by canoeing, but by snowshoeing. Yeah. And further to our discussion on the Vase, for me personally, Ben, when people say, oh, when there's an early spring or when spring arrives, the Vase River from the Lake Nipissing end, that's the place to go because the water's always open. So it's open by at least 2 weeks before anything else opens up. So it's a great place to just get that mind, body, and spirit going in the springtime. So that's another just quick reference in a contemporary fashion about canoeing because you can canoe all the way up and see those hawthorn trees.
Agreed. And so if you're interested in a very short discussion of winter canoeing, even winter camping, building the Quincy hut, freezing your butt off in the middle of the winter. But I've been on the Ottawa River as early as April 10-ish, and I remember one morning waking up, there was a shell of ice right across the river. But snow and ice both sides. You put in at Mattawa, you get it at Rolfton. There's something about canoeing with snow and ice on the banks that's just beautiful. Now, as a quick asterisk, I wear a full dry suit when I do that. I'm not just out there with jeans and a T-shirt. I've got the neoprene cuffs, neck, boots, the whole 9 yards. But it's an interesting, pretty time of the year to be out there. By the end of March, temperatures -3, -5. It's very pleasant to go camping, and it is so quiet. There are no leaves on the trees. I've found myself out early spring camping after snapping my fingers to make sure I can still hear because it's so quiet. But anyway, yeah, there's so much to talk about.
Let's have you back,
Yep.
and that's a good segue. And thanks for coming in and
Yes.
talk about the
I
Vase
have
portages in
one
essence.
super last question because I know we only have a handful of minutes. I'm going to ask you to put your councillor on hat for 1 second, just because I can't not have you with a city councillor right here.
Uh-oh.
Do you think that North Bay is doing, in terms of outdoor tourism and stuff, do you think that we're doing a good job of getting people up here and getting, like, really kind of sharing what we have?
I would say they are. So this relative to Vase, they are trying to promote Vase on their websites. There is a young lady this summer who's going to have canoe carts available to take people through, and that was something that's the result of a chamber commerce funding initiative that helped her. So, but when canoeists come to North Bay, they don't stay in hotels. They probably don't do much in the way of restaurants. They brought their own craft dinner, and they're going to go and hide in the bush for a week. So canoeists don't bring a lot of money in. Some of the outfitters, Algonquin First Outfitters, Algonquin North Outfitters, do very, very well for Algonquin Park. But Vase is a day trip. So I think North Bay does a reasonably good job of promoting the resources, the opportunities that are here. It's limited, I guess, in terms of the number of people who would take advantage of it. But we have seen some groups come up from Toronto, over from Ottawa. I remember one group was retracing Champlain's route, but by bus.
Mm-hmm.
It's Champlain's route, and you're doing it by bus. We actually got a hold of some canoes so they could at least do Elks Beach, and I think we did go all the way through by the end of the day in canoes. And that was probably one of the best days they had. It was middle of June. I bought canoe ponchos, $50 worth of bug spray, because middle of June, you're going through the swamps, you just brace for it to be awful. And it was fine. There actually were no bugs at all. There's a bit of a breeze. And anyway, so there is some interest. It's just hard to, it's just, you're right. You promote it. It's here. Come on up, enjoy it. You're out for a day, and then what?
Yeah.
Oh, next time, paddle in hand, we're going to discuss these canoe routes, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
I could bring my 8-foot-tall Voyager paddle.
Yeah.
There you go. Well, thank you, Chris, so much for coming on, and I'm sure we'll have you back again.
No, Ben, Bill, pleasure to be here, and look forward to coming back whenever you want.
Well, we want to say thank you to Chris, and I'm glad that we actually had him on Echo Essentials late in the year, last year, a few months ago, or else we might not have had him on. Or at least it would have been a bit until it clicked in our brains how much of a no-brainer having Chris on the show would be. I can honestly say I learned so much about waterways of North Bay, and again, had no idea that he was a big outdoors guy. And but once you do some digging into his background, it's pretty obvious. But we will have him back on to talk more about canoeing. We were talking about that. We had a bit of a time crunch with some appointments, so we had to keep things down to a bit of a shorter time. But I'm sure we could have talked for hours. It was a fantastic conversation, super knowledgeable. And as I said in the podcast, it's kind of like sitting there with two Bills. It's just the amount of information and stuff, or two Chris's, depending on how you look at it. So if you enjoyed this episode and you want more Backroads Bill podcast, you can find us on all of your favorite podcast platforms. The video version, as I mentioned in the beginning, includes some of Chris's amazing photos that he's taken and that he graciously allowed us to use. That, of course, you can find on the North Bay Echo YouTube channel or on our website, NorthBayEcho.ca. New episodes of our podcast drop every single Wednesday morning. So that wraps things up for us here. But next week, you want to make sure you tune in because we have revered journalist and author Wabgashig Rice on the show. It was such an amazing opportunity to have him on. Super cool guy, super fun chat. You'll want to make sure that you stick around and make sure you like and follow this podcast so you do not miss it. That's going to come out next Wednesday morning.